First of all, neuroscience is more interested in locating, finding which place is responsible for what function. And so far, most neuroscientists think if a certain function comes from a particular place, then that place is the origin of that function. And that's how they're trying to find the self, what place it is, because they're not taking they're not open to the assumption that the neural network might be simply a network for something else, right? They think it is what generates consciousness, right? So they're trying to find where the consciousness and I think they won't find it that way, but the continuing exploration might make the science questions itself at some point. And that way it could develop maybe into all these networks. What's it? Is it really generating all the experience we have? Or there is something even different than the network that needs the network for the experience, which is my understanding of it. Now, the usual sense of self that people have that is continuing, it is possible to experience it absent. You know, some people actually, even some disordered mental states, sometimes people lose a sense of self. There's no continuous sense of self. And spiritual experiences, of course, there are much of spiritual, what's called spiritual illumination, that the falling away of the sense of self. There's no continuity that is called the self, right? And it's possible to experience all of that, but I think there is a continuity in the sense that is what I called earlier the first person experience. There's always, whatever the experience is, even if we don't see it as a self, it is always, there's a continuity to it, there's a unity to it. And that, I think, we have to go to the what I call individual consciousness. That consciousness, and which is not created by the brain. The way I understand individual consciousness, each one of us is an individual consciousness. And each individual consciousness is a manifestation of a larger ocean of consciousness. So each individual is like a wave, so the waves are not separate from each other. They're all part of the same ocean. But each wave comes through the body and requires the whole mechanism of the body for it to experience the things the way we experience them, in the discriminated, clear, three-dimensional thing. Otherwise, it won't have that kind of experience, you see. And it is that individual consciousness, I think, is what gives the sense of continuity to the fact that there is a unity to experience. We know the experience that happened yesterday, the experience happening today, happening to the same consciousness. From that, people sometimes infer it's a self, but we don't have to call it a self. Or we might not experience it as a self. We might just recognize a continuity of experience. And for me, if we really followed your question, we will find the individual consciousness. Because the ground consciousness, the ocean of consciousness, or the higher self, does not explain the continuity of experience. Does not, because that is beyond time, right, and beyond particulars, you see. We can go through the self into the individual consciousness, into the boundless consciousness, all the way to pure emptiness, and then back into recognizing the individual consciousness that hasn't still present, otherwise there is no experience, you see. And then we can have different kind of ways of experiencing things that are not simply experiencing what is the nature of consciousness, but what are its capacities, what it can do. Like consciousness can know its nature as pure awareness, pure luminosity, or pure empty clarity. But it can also do other things. It can my consciousness can know your consciousness from inside your heart. I could know your heart from inside your heart, not from outside. That's the capacity that consciousness has, you see. When we recognize the nature of consciousness, the other thing that can happen, this is not just, nature of consciousness is important for liberation, but what happens after liberation? You don't just sit liberated, you live, and when you live is learn. Learn means what does consciousness do? What are its possibilities? What are its potential? We can know each other, we can know each other, we can know realities in so many ways. We could know the past and the future, and we could know the past. We can even, like, you know, I can know my thoughts, right? I can know somebody else's thought, but it is possible if we develop this capacity of consciousness that I can go into Einstein's mind and think his thoughts. The consciousness has that possibility. And imagine the possibility of knowledge that we can have. Like me, each one of us has the potential of knowing everything that everybody ever known. Because the consciousness doesn't have those limitations, you see. So people but stop and, oh, okay, I'm free, I'm experiencing pure consciousness, which is good, it is important, but then there is another journey, you see, which is understanding what happens then. How do you live? What do you learn? What do realized people learn? What do they do? And I think that is already happening in many ways by many people who are not even realized. They have many of those experiences and questions. Well, what I meant, the individual consciousness, I didn't say it doesn't have a center. It doesn't have self-centeredness. It does not have to say it's mine. Because the way the self knows itself is by saying, this is mine, this is not mine. This is me, and this is you, right? So it separates itself, and it says, that's how I know myself. That is a self-reference or self-centeredness. The individual consciousness can have experience without that thought, without that way of looking at things. It's then everything that's happening is just what's happening, you see. Who's experiencing it? Nobody's experiencing it, it's just happening. There isn't even an experiencer. It's just experience. Much of our suffering is because of our identification and because the constructs that make up the self, psychological constructs from history that make up the sense of self-identity, have in them all the patterns that happen in history. And when we reenact them over and over again. So we create a lot of pain and suffering and worry and misery. That, plus the fact that the moment we identify ourselves as a self, that's continuing in time, it's very important for us to preserve its integrity and its continuity. And that can bring lots of aggression, lots of fear, a lot of suffering for ourselves and for others. And so when we don't have that center, it's not like the body doesn't have pain. There isn't the usual psychological anxiety and reaction about it. Because we are more, the consciousness, the pure awareness is more dominant. And the pure awareness has the quality of feeling good. Many people studied that, you know. I mean, it's not my area of study, but it seems from what I explored, my reading, exploration of people who've done research, it seems the sense of self has developed throughout, you know, millions of years, you know, not in the last few thousand years. The last few thousand years sort of the same. Everybody has a sense of self the way we know it. But maybe if you, 1 million, 2 million years ago, human beings weren't as self-centered as now. I mean, the self wasn't that constructed. Was very still in its beginning, its infancy. because there was just the individual consciousness without much constructs, which we can be now through spiritual realization. We can let go of the construct. However, we have our knowledge, our understanding, so we're not primitive. But I think, yeah, there has been a development, and it probably will continue development.
Do you think the internet or this global interconnectedness through technologies impacts the...
It's an interesting question. It's something for us to find out, right? It's really interesting. I think it can go either way, and probably both ways will happen, which is that the internet can bring interconnectedness, right? There's communication, there's interconnected, we know what's happening with each other, and it can bring us together, right? There is that possibility, and it's happening. But at the same time, the internet can do, although it connects us with each other, it might disconnect us from ourselves, because we are more, with bits of data, and the information is more important than the immediate experience. And we're looking at the computer instead of living our life. We hearing our friend, we're getting a text message instead of sitting with them and talking with them. So that creates a distance from the lived experience. So that can happen too. So which one of those is going to dominate? And I don't know. There's probably an interplay. And that might be other effects that also haven't been thought about. You can see it can go, it can be a wonderful thing. It brings people together, and it has, but also individually, it could distance us from ourselves, while spiritual work or psychological work is to become more intimate, closer to ourselves, more immediate. So we can feel our feelings, sense our sensation. We are really in our consciousness, not outside of it or apart from it. Unless at some point somebody can develop the internet so that it helps us to be embodied, we can interact with our totality, not just through text, not just tweet. We can touch each other. Maybe we can touch each other. Spiritually say that's possible. We can touch each other at a distance. See, maybe the internet will create a way of that happening. Well, the way science influenced me is that it's not like I directly use science to inquire. It's more like my mind has been trained by science. My consciousness learned the scientific method. The scientific method became part of my learning, right? The scientific method, the need for verification, the need to experiment, the need to corroborate findings, and also, and that way, so my method of spiritual work is more scientific. It has scientific principles in it. In that way, I use science. It's more the philosophy of science, the methodology of science, is very much expressed by the kind of inquiry I practice and teach. Then I use scientific theories and ideas because they're as parallels that gives us some kind of insight into our spiritual nature. I don't try to make them the same, because they're not the same, really. It's hard to tell what's the relationship between the two. You see, I don't want to make statements just because I see parallels, say, oh, this is the same. It has to be verified. So I'm scientific that way. Because many people say, well, science shows that everything is waves. That's what quantum theory said. So that means this must be the same thing as what some of the Tantra says, that everything is vibration. No, not necessarily. They talk about the same thing. They probably talk about very different things, but they sound similar. And maybe there is some kind of relationship. But we have to verify what is the relationship before we make a statement of truth. That's how my inquiry is scientific. There's no end to spiritual experience. The spiritual experience doesn't have an end. Some traditions believe there's an end when they get enlightened, or they get realized, or get awakened. The end, and basically the self is gone. But there are other traditions that say there's no end, because reality has no end. In fact, some of the Sufi teaching, they talk about stations of the way. They say they said stations of the way cannot be out-traveled. There's no last station. And that's my experience, is that even the transcendence and the return of transcendence, and the things that what happens. That's what I was saying earlier. What do realized people do? They learn more. Realization reveals further realization. The other ways of realization, other ways of experience. And I gave some examples. But I think the potential is infinite. And that's what's exciting. Like the spiritual realization opens the door to live life and to be in reality in ways in this life and after this life and outside of this life. The possibilities are infinite. Yeah. So I don't hold the view. The teaching I teach doesn't hold the view that there is a particular state or is the end, and one made it. I mean, there are stages like that when you feel, yes, you can be, you can stay there, you're wonderfully happy, you're not suffering. But that doesn't mean there's no more learning. That reality doesn't have other faces of itself that it can show. Reality has many faces. And the essence of reality always shows itself in a face. It cannot show itself without a face, because there's nothing there to show. It's always a face. And there's no end to those faces.